Thank you, Steve. A number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you. Minutes.
The minutes of the ordinary meeting of the Society of Antiquaries of London held on Thursday, 24th November 2022 at York St John University, York. Professor Martin Millett, President in the Chair. The minutes of the ordinary meeting of Thursday, 17th November 2022 were read and signed. The certificates of candidates for election were laid before the Society in order to be suspended in the usual manner. The following communication was then laid before the Society. Our Council in the North, Current Reflections and Future Research Directions at the King's Manor, York, by Dr. Catherine Giles, FSA. Thanks for return for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting will be on Thursday, 1st December 2022, then adjourned the meeting.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. Certificates.
I just remind fellows I'm reading a shortened version and you can read more on the website. Stuart Palmer, Chief Archaeologist, Archaeology, Warwickshire, who has published on later prehistoric and Romano British Warwickshire. Andreas Petzold, BA, PhD, an art historian and an authority on Romanesque art, with interest in the study of colour in medieval manuscripts and stained glass. Mitchell Pollington, BA, MA, Director of Archaeology and Heritage at Lamprey Services. Otto Sommeray-Smith, BA, MPhil, PhD, an architectural historian and assistant professor at the University of Warwick. Christopher Scott, BA, MA, an archaeologist and heritage consultant who has contributed significantly to the understanding of industrial archaeology in the northeast of England. Jyotsna Singh, PhD, Professor of Early Modern Literature and Culture at Michigan State University, specializing in early modern histories of Islam. Simon Smith, BA, MA, PhD, Associate Professor of Shakespeare and Early Modern Drama at the Shakespeare Institute, University of Birmingham, and specializing in theatre history and playhouse music.
Is it your pleasure that these certificates be suspended in the usual manner? I would draw your attention to the fact that, as announced at the EGM earlier this afternoon, the vote on Order 3 means that blue papers will now be suspended by being displayed online on the Fellows platform. They will be available henceforth from the time reading for a minimum of 4 weeks before the ballot opens. I think our first ballot in the new mode is destined to be in February. Admissions.
Following being in attendance and having signed the obligation required by the statutes, desire to be admitted a fellow. Cornelius Barton and Guy Hunt.
We now come to the main business of today's meeting, which we now come to the main business of today's meeting, which is to hear our paper. Our speaker this evening is Hugh Doherty, who's a lecturer in the School of History at the University of East Anglia, who works on early medieval, early 12th century charters, miracle narratives and text. He's a former student, was trained by the late Richard Sharp, Professor of Diplomatic, and Richard's obit, him as a diplomatic scholar, will appear in the forthcoming issue of Archives. It's a great pleasure to welcome Hugh to present his paper, Peter Le Neve, Society of Antiquaries, and the Anglo-Norman Peace of 1101. Welcome.
Excellent. As you can see, I can't spell antiquaries. Good start. Great honor to speak today. I came here on many occasions with Richard Sharp, brought here, listened to many papers, and it was always a privilege and a joy. And I made a number of friends through coming to these occasions. We start on the 3rd of November, 1101, in the castle at Windsor, William I's great fortress, where his youngest son, Henry, King of the English, had convened a great court, attended by his queen, his new queen, Matilda, 2 archbishops, 10 bishops, 1 papal legate, 10 abbots, 9 chaplains, 5 counts, 3 earls, and at least 22 other members of the laity. Also present, most importantly, was Robert, Duke of the Normans. His presence there was a result of the accidental killing of that most charismatic of Norman kings, William II, a profoundly charismatic king. I think his shadow is cast over the 12th century in all sorts of interesting ways. Suger, Abbot of Saint-Denis, the king that he's writing about in relation to his own Louis VI is William II. William II's death in August 1100 in the New Forest created a crisis that his youngest brother seized, Henry making himself king, and also inviting a challenge from their elder brother, Duke Robert, who crossed the narrow sea in July 1101 with significant support, coming to make war on the English kingdom against his youngest brother. Battle was averted. Peace was made. A number of contemporaries refer to those strenuous mediators who worked to bind the 2 brothers in a lasting peace. And following the settlement, the drafting of this conventio, this settlement, the court then convened on the 3rd of September, 1101. 3rd of September, not November, sorry. 3rd of September, 1101 at Windsor. The date is significant. In this recreation here is from Stephen Brindle's splendid new volume on Windsor Castle. He starts this chapter on New Windsor with the meeting of this court, but he dates it to Michaelmas, not to the 3rd of September, but the feast, the date mattered. On the 3rd of September is the feast of the ordination of Gregory the Great, a feast that Lanfranc, Archbishop of Canterbury, had supported and sustained. And this was very likely, the meeting of the court on the 3rd of September, 1101, was the occasion when Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, delivered a sermon on the ordination of St. Gregory. This sermon travelled with manuscripts connected with Eadmer of Canterbury, and Richard Southern made a brilliant case to attribute it to Anselm. Anselm had been one of those mediators, almost certainly, and now he delivered a sermon that drew upon that prestigious connection between the English and Rome to emphasize reconciliation and unity to the Norman, the Anglo-Norman elite. If Robert was receptive to these sentiments, I'm almost certain that King Henry was not. War had been averted, but 5 years later, in September 1106, Henry would finally defeat his brother in battle and thereby make himself de facto Duke of the Normans. We know all this. We can reconstruct this court on the 3rd of September 1101 because of two charters. The first, issued for John, Bishop of Bath, granting, or rather confirming and enlarging Bishop John's control over the city of Bath and its rights and revenues, a significant grant. The original does not survive. It survives only as a late 12th century copy, early 13th century copy rather, in the Bath cartulary. And that's what's in front of you here. And you can see that the copyist, a member of the monastic community at Bath, has made an effort to copy the extensive lists of witnesses to this great charter. The second charter is a charter, another charter of King Henry for Herbert de Lozinger, Bishop of Norwich, granting him the important manor and forest of Thorpe, just across the Wensum from where Herbert was in the process of constructing his great Roman basilica that would become Norwich Cathedral. This also, as a complete text, only survives as a cartulary copy. There are many registers, cartularies maintained by the monks at Norwich, but only this one, the third registrum, provides the text of the complete grant. And once again, you can see how the monk at Holy Trinity Norwich has made an effort to copy the long list of witnesses who witnessed this actum and were present for this very important court. One of the other interesting details discovered 40 years ago was a relatively brief writ of Robert, Duke of the Normans, who's present at that court on 3rd of September. He's there now, an ally of his brother for now, and he issues a writ for Bath confirming this grant, his brother's grant. And you can see it here. And survives in that same Bath cartulary. I'm almost certain that he would have issued a similar confirmation for Bishop Herbert de Lozinger, Bishop of Norwich, but the monks of Norwich did not choose to include it in their many cartulary books. And it can be demonstrated that they were very keen to make a careful selection of their muniments. We know of a number of important documents of other rulers and other counts that they did not include in their great memory books. So it's very likely, though it doesn't survive, that Robert would also, Duke Robert, would have confirmed his brother's gift to Bishop Herbert of Norwich. So two remarkable charters, both issued on the feast of the ordination of St. Gregory. Now, Barbara Dodwell, in her very important edition of the Charters of Norwich Cathedral Priory, 2 volumes for the Pipe Roll Society, this is really the only edition of the Latin text. There is an English calendar in the Regesta Regum Anglo-Norman series, but it's Barbara Dodwell, in itself a very interesting figure, who provides the only reliable Latin and complete Latin text of Henry I's charter. She worked exclusively from those same register books, those same cartularies. But I think we can go further. We can explore what happened to this original of Henry I for Bishop Herbert. In this early 14th century inventory compiled by the monks, you can see there at the top of the list a charter of King Henry confirming the manor of Thorpe in duplicate, 2 copies. Whenever inventories list this with early 12th century acta, sometimes it starts the alarm bells ringing. These are referring to multiple copies, sometimes forgeries, but it is also conceivable that these grand diplomas were issued in more than 1 copy on such a dramatic occasion. One perhaps for Bishop Herbert, one perhaps for the monks. It's unclear, but this is a clear reference to at least one of the originals of that charter for Bishop Herbert. Our next reference to the charter for Bishop Herbert of King Henry is found in Clement Rayner's Apostolatus Benedictinorum in Anglia of 1626. This was part of an important dialogue within the Anglo-Irish Catholic community. In 1619, Pope Urban V had united the 3 disparate orders of Benedictine monks starved by Irish and Englishmen on the continent. Monks connected with Spanish communities, monks connected with Italian communities, monks connected with Flemish communities. These were all now united. But it was just like the Benedictines not to accept this. There was a small faction of English Benedictines, exiled or indeed writing in secret in England, who denounced the union. So there is a brief flurry of texts demonstrating that the Benedictine order was always ruled from Rome and was not some sort of organic English development. And Clement Rayner's Apostolatus is a salvo against that minority English faction, demonstrating the long links between the Benedictine order and the continent. But Rayner drew on the work of a very interesting figure, David Baker, his religious name Augustine Baker, who set about collecting texts to prove the case against this minor faction. Baker, through his broad intellectual network, was able to draw on a number of scholars who provided him with different texts. And among the texts they supplied him was a copy of this charter of Henry I. And it's there in this Jesus College manuscript. These manuscripts all belong to, there's 4 manuscripts, that belong to Augustine Baker. They're not all in his hand, so it reveals the kind of networks of learning and scholarship that he could draw upon and assistance. Just here, this is what makes it so interesting. This was not copied from one of the many registers, cartulary books of Norwich Cathedral. The marginal note, though struck through and difficult to read, makes it clear that it was copied from the original. So we have in the early 1610s, the original still very much in existence and seen. So it's Baker's copy that allows Rayner to print it in his volume. Where Baker found the original remains an enigma. He was a correspondent of Sir Robert Cotton, and through Cotton was enjoyed a number of important ties to antiquaries of the late 16th, early 17th century British Isles. This is a very interesting letter from Baker to Cotton, only one of all of their correspondence to survive in the Cotton papers. And it does give us a tantalizing glimpse of the sort of records that Cotton may have provided. There are charters for Norwich Cathedral Priory among the Cotton charters. So they must have been purloined at some point, made their way to that great scholar thief, Sir Robert Cotton. But many of these Cotton charters from Norwich are listed in various catalogues of the Cotton charters made before the terrible Cotton fire. But this one, this great diploma of Henry I, is not listed in these catalogues of charters in the Cotton Library. So it remains unclear, but Baker clearly saw the original. Our next clue in our chain is provided by Francis Blomfield, the great antiquary of Norfolk, his superb 5-volume history. The first volume published in 1739. He did not live to see its complete publication. Blomfield had access to all sorts of interesting things. And in the 4th volume, right on his entry, it's organized, of course, like so many of these 18th century volumes of history, organized by Ville, township and manor. He provides in a footnote, he gives the witness list for that charter, from that charter of Henry I to Bishop Herbert. And you can see it there. So that's where it is at the bottom of his page, a handsome footnote, the days when publishers allowed such footnotes. And then in close-up, there is the list of witnesses given from the original, as Blomfield makes clear in this final sentence of the entry for Thorpe. The original grant of this manor in 1728 was in Matthew Howard, and a copper plate was engraven from it by Mr. Sturt. And that's all that Blomfield tells us about where he's taken this remarkable witness list. So we have a glimpse here in the early 18th century, again, to this lost actum. And that's where we now finally bring in Peter Le Neve. A very interesting figure, and in many ways, a marginalized figure. He had no entry in the original Oxford Dictionary of National Biography. He does now. So and there's very little being published, serious work on Le Neve. So he's a very important figure. He published nothing. Okay, so his impression, he's no Dugdale, but his everywhere in many different bibliographic repositories across the British Isles and beyond, there are manuscripts, rolls, charters associated with Peter Le Neve. In 1684, he's made Deputy Chamberlain of the Exchequer, a post he held for almost all his life. In 1690, he's made Rouge-Croix Pursuivant. 1704, finally, he's made Norway King of Arms. And indeed, he would serve a decade later as the stand-in Garter King of Arms because of the death of the Garter. This here is a formulary for the coronation of His Most Excellent Majesty King George I on Wednesday, the 20th of October, 1714. This is Peter Le Neve's own copy, as you can see. I've advanced this to the present Garter King of Arms, David Vine Williams, who has been very helpful, and hopefully it will be of assistance with his own duties next May. Peter Le Neve also plays an important part in the induction of senior figures of the Hanoverian family into the order of the Garter, crossing back and forth between England and Hanover. He is a correspondent and friend of many of the leading antiquaries of the period. This is a letter to Peter from the great Thomas Tanner, a figure who had a profound influence on the study of East Anglia, and specifically, of course, Cambridgeshire, as well as a student of bibliographical works and manuscripts. You can see there the address, the good Mr. Norrie. Peter Le Neve connected with men like Tanner and others, and his correspondence found in most repositories in the British Isles. Now, His connections to these individuals also means, however, that he is purchasing manuscripts, acquiring charters and heraldic rolls, but also is selling them in his lifetime. So he's selling important medieval manuscripts to the voracious Humphrey Wanley, as well as others. This makes it difficult to track down the Peter Le Neve papers and charters. But that's only part of the story. The other issue here is that his will was contested. His will was contested, and the books were sold over 12 days, and the sale catalogues give us some insight to his collections. And the remainder passed to his own Norfolk friend, Thomas Martin, honest Thomas Martin, as he's known. Thomas Martin married Peter Le Neve's widow, largely, it seems, to acquire the remainder of Le Neve's collection. So Martin gets an important section of the manuscripts and charters. However, Martin is in dire financial straits and proceeds in the course of his life to begin to sell them. And that means that Peter Le Neve manuscripts and memoranda are like a kind of flotsam on the bibliographical sea. You can find them in all different corners. But they always reward examination, discovery, and identification. Let me give you some examples, the things that he saw. This is from one of his many notebooks in the British Library. At the top, we have a writ charter of King Henry I for Ramsey Abbey. Peter Le Neve does not specify the source of this text, likely from the cartulary in the Exchequer office where he worked. The second charter, I want to give you two examples here, is a charter of Richard de Balliol of the 1150s with a fantastic witness list, with a very, very interesting and new sheriff of East Anglia, of Suffolk. So a very valuable document in its own right. That's just one page from one of his many notebooks. Now, you have to work very hard with these notebooks. There's a lot of, shall we say, dross at times, but there's also some real treasure in there. Another example, this is buried, and I do mean buried, in the Norfolk Record Office. This is a writ charter, an unknown writ charter of King Stephen for Horsham St. Faith. Le Neve has translated it here from the original 12th century Latin, and he's given us an exact and precise translation for the small Benedictine house just outside of Norwich, very important community about which we'd like to know so much more. We have this very interesting 12th century narrative that survives in an 18th century copy about Horsham St. Faith and about its foundation in the early 12th century. And we only have one charter from the early 12th century, but this is another, seen by Peter Le Neve. And he saw it in the archive, among the muniments of Sir Henry Hobart in 1697. The Hobart archive, alas, remains untraced. The problem is for confronting Peter Le Neve is that in the following year, in 1698, Peter's brother Oliver Le Neve killed Sir Henry Hobart in a duel over charges of cowardice on a military campaign in Ireland. And that means Oliver Le Neve has to flee to the Low Countries, and for 3 years, Peter Le Neve manages his brother's estates. But that also means that from that date onwards, Peter Le Neve's access to the Hobart muniments is pretty much closed. So this is all that we have of this lost 12th century charter. In 1717, he is elected the first president of this learned society. He was one of the first members meeting in that tavern in Fleet Street with Humphrey Wanley, his ally and rival in the acquisition of medieval monuments and manuscripts, and then is elected at the first serious meeting. There had been some challenges to the fortunes of the society, partly through the fall of Edward Harley, and serves as president for close to the next decade. Arthur MacGregor's excellent chapter in the volume celebrating the foundation of the Society of Antiquaries makes very clear that this society was very keen to see objects, items, finds acquired, excavated by members of this society. And indeed, the minute books record the gift of Roman urns, coins, and all sorts of other items. And Peter Le Neve is part of that. He is attending the meetings of the society, bearing objects to demonstrate and show the other fellows. But he's also, and this is important, and to some extent is not brought out in MacGregor's excellent chapter, one of Peter Le Neve's invaluable contributions to the early society is to attend meetings bearing documents or copies of documents. He more often brings documents and copies of documents rather than objects for show and tell. Let me give you two examples. This is the return of Hilary, Bishop of Chichester, to the survey of 1166, the survey commanded by King Henry II, King Henry I's grandson and namesake. In 20th of June, 1720, the minutes record that Peter Le Neve turned up with this very act of the Bishop of Chichester. This is the only one to be found, states the minutes. This is surely echoing Peter Le Neve's own proud statement in the document that he is borne around among the fellows. In fact, it's not. There's another. Most of the returns to the survey of 1166 survive in early 13th century copies, but there are two fascinating survivals, and this return of Hilary, Bishop of Chichester, is one of them. In fact, Peter Le Neve writes in a letter to Thomas Hearne that he had discovered Hilary's charter in a sack in the Tower archive and had reorganized it and preserved it. He's very proud of this moment in this letter of 7th of June, 1728. I mean, in many ways, this gives us a wonderful glimpse of the sort of documents that he has access to. One of the frustrating things, if we just go back to the King Stephen abstract, is that after Peter Le Neve's death in September 1729, a number of his contemporaries in the College of Arms complain about the nature of his notes. Small, scrappy notes is the comment that frequently appears, and you can see. And this is relatively straightforward for Peter Le Neve. More often, they're like this: scraps of paper stuck into booklets, organized by manner. But they're not always. The Norfolk Record Office often has stacks of these notes that are unsorted, unfoliated. So referencing them is a nightmare, and just working your way through them is a challenge. But here, at least, we have a glimpse into the kind of documents that Le Neve has access to, and in some cases, owned. Another example, this is a wonderful actum of Herbert de Lozinger, Bishop of Norwich himself, the same recipient of King Henry I's grant of the Manor of Thorpe. It survives now in the Norfolk Record Office. And again, Peter Le Neve on the 8th of December, 1725, brings it to the society. You'll see it just here. Also, a copy of the original deed, a copy has been made of Herbert, Bishop of Norwich, from the archives there. So it does give us a sense of the porous nature of the cathedral archives, that things are passing out of the cathedral archive into the hands of Peter Le Neve. And in this instance, he certainly returned it because it's still there among the cathedral muniments. Okay. So 17th of March, 1727, Peter Le Neve attends the meeting and brings another document. Just here. Mr. Norway brought an ancient original charter of ye possession of Mr. Matthew Howard of Hackney, of your donation of your manor of Thorpe near Norwich to Herbert de Lozinger, Bishop of Norwich, and ye convent, dated the 9th of September, 1101, fairly writ upon parchment with many witnesses and signed with crosses, the seal lost. So this is clearly the original charter, that same charter of King Henry I for Bishop Herbert. And then in 17th of April, 1729, Mr. Norrie attends another meeting and now brings the society something else. Mr. Norrie presented the society with two deeds. One of these is from the abbot and monks of St. Benet's Home to Richard Bassett, the manor of the Antiquaries scribe here has written Beham. He means Hayham. He's misread the 12th century H as a B. For his life with a seal. That's the first, that's the second of the two deeds presented to the society in April 1729. And the next one is again that other original, one of Henry I being a grant of the manor of Thorpe to the Church of Holy Trinity in Norwich, remarkable for the great number of witnesses. And then what's of interest is the final sentence of this entry. He also presented each member with one of each, for which he had the thanks of the society. So copies have been made of these two charters and given to the members of the society attending this meeting, or possibly for all of the members. The membership at this date remains unclear, possibly as high as somewhere as 95, possibly much smaller. But each of these members may have received copies of these two charters commissioned by Peter Le Neve himself. The second of those charters, is that the charter of the abbot and monks of St. Benet's Home to Richard Bassett. This still survives among the Harley collection, and indeed Le Neve must have borrowed it from the Harley collection. He's very good friends with Humphrey Wanley. He had a particular interest in this charter because 100 years previously, on the 6th of August, 1632, his distant relation, William Le Neve, gave this very charter to Sir Symonds D'Ewes. Sir Symonds D'Ewes writes about acquiring this charter on this day in 1632. He describes his joy at holding it as he walked through the city of London. Sir Symonds D'Ewes was very happy to have this charter in his possession because he claimed descent from the Bassets. And there the charter, it remains among the Harley collection. It's a fascinating charter, and the seal is now much worn. Of this, Richard Bassett is one of the leading figures of King Henry I's court in the 1120s, one of his men raised from the dust, to use the label of one contemporary. And he's shown here fighting some sort of demonic beast. The copies of these two charters commissioned by Peter Le Neve for the fellows enters the antiquarian bloodstream, as it were. And so you find these engravings in the possession of various other later 18th, early 19th century antiquaries. Let me give you an example. This is James York, Bishop of Ely. This on the left here is his own copy of Francis Blomfield's essay towards a history of the county of Norfolk. And this is now in the Cambridge UL. And facing that page on Hayham, Bishop York has inserted this engraving that he had received of the Richard Bassett Charter given to the Society, but in April 1729. So that's where York has added it to his volume in exactly the right place in the volume. So he's inserted it and given it its own foliation. And you can find these engravings of the Richard Bassett Charter in all sorts of archives and custody of different antiquaries. The same is also true of engravings commissioned by Peter Le Neve of the Charter of Henry I for Bishop Herbert. These also survive in the possession of multiple antiquaries who were either there in April 1729 or who acquired it at a later date. So there are two copies among the Gough engravings acquired by Richard Gough from unclear sources. He has two wonderful, handsome books of engravings, and these are largely, almost all, from the Society, from engravings given to the Society of Antiquaries. So two of these engravings of the Charter survive in the Bodleian. Another survives here in the Society of Antiquaries upstairs in the Harley collection, purchased during the Harley sale in the spring of 1742. And there are also copies in the British Library. So we've got about 5 different copies of these of the engravings, Peter Le Neve's engravings for the Society of this lost charter. And as you can see, it gives us not only the witness list, but also the text of the entire diploma. Now, I have asked the Oracle in Cambridge, Tessa Webber, perhaps the finest paleographer in the British Isles, matched only, I think, by my friend James Willoughby, who may be tuning in from Brazil, I hope. She is clear that this is a kosher actum of the first decade of the 12th century, and very likely of an authentic hand of a Norwich monk, a Norman-influenced Norwich monk. So there is a good case to see this as an authentic actum of Henry I. And we can say that because of Peter Le Neve's engravings, because they now survive, though never been used, never used in the edition by Barbara Dodwell, largely ignored by the editors of the Regesta Regum Anglo-Norman. Now, however, we can state clearly that this is the text of an authentic actum. And Francis Blomfield, who provided this fascinating reference to the actum, must have acquired Peter Le Neve's own engraving. Some of the papers passed from Peter Le Neve to Thomas Martin, and then from Thomas Martin to Francis Blomfield. So we have a witness to another copy of this last actum. It doesn't survive the copy acquired by Francis Blomfield, but that's what he clearly used, because the date 1728, the Hennes Matthew Howard, this is written on Peter Le Neve's engraving. This is where Francis Blomfield has taken it. And what's interesting here is that Peter Le Neve in April 1729 is almost certainly aware that he's dying. He draws up his will about a week later, and he will die in September the same year. This is very much his gift to the Society. In fact, it's his final gift to the Society. These two charters that meant a great deal to him and that he understood their importance. So he commissions these engravings as a gift to the society, and he commissions one of the finest engravers of 1720s London, and that's John Sturt. And John Sturt's speciality was engraving of 11th, 12th, 13th century charters. Sturt is in himself a remarkable figure. He had been commissioned by James Anderson for the engravings of his great Selectus Diplomatum, which is engravings of early 12th century, 13th century charters of the Scottish kings and nobility. And they are wonderful. In fact, Tessa Webber has said to me that the quality is so good, you can still identify the scribes, which generally with engravings is not the case. But Sturt is such a master of his art that the quality and detail of the script help in identifications. So he's a serious figure. However, he is left in a great deal of debt. Anderson dies before the Selectus is published, and leaving most of the financial burden in already a pretty cutthroat bookseller market on poor John Sturt. And when he dies in 1730, he's penniless. But nevertheless, he had been commissioned by Peter Le Neve to engrave these two charters, Charter of Henry I and the Charter for Richard Bassett. So Peter Le Neve has spared no expense for the early society of Antiquaries. There is, however, one fascinating clue left, and that's a note at the bottom of Richard Gough's, one of the two Richard Gough copies of the Le Neve engraving. And there, Gough has added the note that Pennes John Ives, the Suffolk antiquary, who of a short life died brutally young in 1776, a great collector of manuscripts, a serious scholar. Contemporaries praised his youthful good looks. John Ives, this is a very tantalizing reference. His papers have also largely suffered. Some of them survive, but this note could imply the survival of this original charter for Bishop Herbert among Ives' papers in 1774. But there, the path goes cold. So watch this space. Who knows? It might turn up behind some aristocratic piano or under the floorboards, or in one of the many unsorted boxes in the Norfolk Record Office, one of the great record offices of the British Isles. It's worth just in bringing this all together, in underlining the importance of this actum for Bishop Herbert. His acquisition of Thorpe gave him a significant slice of property on the edge of Norwich. It was the site of a lucrative and very important source of profit and control in 12th century Norwich and Norfolk, the great forest of Thorpe, which is referred to by a number of 12th century contemporaries. It was with good reason that only 4 years after his death, the monks of Norwich, here in the mortuary roll of Vitalis, Abbot of Savigny, perhaps one of the greatest documents to survive from the early 12th century, now in Paris. And I had a fantastic afternoon exploring this wonderful mortuary roll. They don't get it out for anybody. They get it. I was only able to see it because the archivists were willing to reveal it to the great American medievalist who's been working in the Archives Nationales, Peggy Brown, E.A.R. Brown. She goes right back to the late post-war archivist of the Archives Nationales, and what she wants, she gets. She even gets her own room. So we were able to explore this mortuary roll. And you can see there that the monks have, like many members of monastic communities, have entered a block of text commemorating the dead, the valued dead, the commemorated dead. Above all, their benefactor and patron, Bishop Herbert. This is only within 4 years of Bishop Herbert's death. He was a remarkable figure in all sorts of ways. Henry of Huntingdon, one of the great writers of the early 12th century, praises Herbert both for his learning and for his humanity. Bishop Herbert says Henry of Huntingdon warned against predictions of the apocalypse. The apocalypse, says Bishop Herbert, according to Henry of Huntingdon, might not happen for another 1,000 years, which would be about now. It's a very humane response from Bishop Herbert. One contemporary narrative constructed at Ely describes him as vir eloquentissimus, that most eloquent of men. Now, I mentioned earlier that Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, had played a decisive part in brokering the peace between King Henry and Duke Robert. The contemporaries do not specify the other mediators, but almost certainly Bishop Herbert was one of them. He had close ties with the monastic community of Faircamp. We have fragments of the Faircamp necrology, and these make clear that at least 10 monks from Faircamp were recruited by Herbert, he himself was from Faircamp, and joined him in this new community at Norwich. Not only that, but one of these monks served as his own confessor. So he's got links to this important monastic powerhouse in Duke Robert's Normandy. And he was also valued for his diplomatic skills. Henry I is frequently dispatching him to secure deals or protect the king's interests in Rome. Herbert is a great traveler to Rome. I think that's partly why he builds such a Roman basilica in this trading emporium on the Wensum. And more than that, it was interesting, we get a glimpse of his diplomatic skills from the other side, from his opponents, the canons of York, who of course detest the Canterbury party, record in no uncertain terms the triumph at Bishop Herbert falling sick on a diplomatic mission to Rome and not making the papal curia. So they lost their best player, and the canons of York crow about this in a fascinating narrative. So I think that this grant of Thorpe is part of a reward for Bishop Herbert's part in securing this peace. A narrative also produced at Norwich records that the manor of Thorpe had been held by King Henry's queen, Matilda. They had married within the year. So this must have been a wedding gift of the king to the queen. And then on the queen's supplication, that's the implication of this narrative, the manor was then given to Bishop Herbert. So we see some interesting horse trading between king, queen, and Bishop Herbert. Essentially, this bought Henry time, a breathing space in which to survive Duke Robert's invasion, of a serious challenge to King Henry's rule, and then shore up his own resources for what he was surely planning from a very early date, which was the invasion of the Duchy of the Normans. And that's exactly what King Henry will do. So this charter in itself has immense historical interest at a critical moment in the history of the Anglo-Norman polity. In my talk today, I've tried to bring and connect two very different moments: the making of peace at a moment of crisis in the Anglo-Norman regnum, and the foundation and flourishing of the Society of Antiquaries. And the decisive figure here, the connecting figure, is Peter Le Neve. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Hugh. That was a really splendid piece of work, just the way that everything follows through, and we end up with not only the text and its historical significance, but this the activity of the antiquaries in the 18th century, which is particularly interesting to see. Can I open this up for questions and comments from the floor?
This is very ad feminam. Two archivists here, delighted that you're honouring women archivists. Thank you. And my guest is from the Freemasons, where they're having a big exhibition next year, which of course will include absolutely this generation, the Le Neve generation of antiquaries, and hoping that there will be a great deal more interest in the intellectual overlap, the activities of that rather small group of intellectuals exchanging their interests and joining together to celebrate their enthusiasm for the past. It's something I hope Katie's going to put in Salon, perhaps just after Christmas. The exhibition will open in the spring. But there is a bit of a debate about Peter Le Neve as to whether he was a Freemason or not. I think Joan Evans thinks he was, but the people at the Freemasons aren't quite sure.
Nor am I. I haven't followed up, but nor have I seen any evidence of that in his correspondence. So I mean, I've no trace of that in a way. His correspondence is, because of what happened to his papers, is all over the place. His in tray, as it were, there's an out tray in different repositories, but his in tray is also dispersed, and some of it uncatalogued in the Norfolk Record Office. Absolutely, absolutely. Anderson's a very, very interesting figure.
You've stunned everyone with your scholarship. I'm very interested in the way these networks work, and you made some mention of uncertainty about how big the network was in the 1720s in the Antiquaries. Do you have a feeling for that? How many of them were actively how many of these copies do you think he had to print?
Well, they're precisely as we saw with the James York example. It's precisely the sort of item that you might stuff in your copy of Blomfield's Norfolk. And they are, and in Cambridge with York's copy, the editions have not been catalogued. It's not even clear that you don't realize that it's York's copy until you summon it up. And that is interestingly the case also for Peter Le Neve's books. There are a number of printed books with his marginalia in the British Library, and very rarely are these noted in the catalogues. But if you order one up, they have his notes and copies. He adds copies of lost charters in the margins of his printed books. I was able to supply to my colleague, Professor Nicholas Vincent, whose majestic edition of the Charters of Henry II came out last year, a copy of a charter that survives only from a marginal entry in a printed book that Peter Le Neve owned from the original. So it's quite difficult to get a sense. So if we ballpark figure, if we guess that there are about 90 antiquaries, possibly 90 of these copies, 180 if you include the Richard Bassett. Those copies are very important because they provide a very good representation of the seal. Sturt's engraving of Richard Bassett's seal, as you can see, it's deteriorated. And there's been some argument about what that seal signifies. The copy that's always been used is in Sir Christopher Hatton's Book of Seals, but in fact there are many more thanks to Peter Le Neve. But even today, this afternoon, I was in the British Library and I found 2 more copies. So they're out there somewhere, but ballpark figure no more than 90. Depends how generous Peter Le Neve wanted to be. If it was just for those who turned up on Fleet Street in the tavern, maybe just 10, but possibly 90.
On that subject, first thing, Rare Books Librarian at the UL, and I've already made a note to recatalogue and add a note about that. I think there are two printed lists of members of this society, I think sort of mid 1730s and 40s. And there's something like 50 or 60 or so. So that might give you a sense. But I think also early on, I think it was the case that members, when they had things like this produced, it was a duty of being a member that you had to give a copy to all the other members. So I think it's likely probably that there would have been at least as many of however many members there were at the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was looking at those lists this afternoon.
Yeah.
And I was struck by, however, their complexity with, I mean, you're absolutely right, but the names crossed out and those owing fees. Do you give an engraving to someone who hasn't paid their fees?
Still a problem for societies today.
You're absolutely right to make the point that there was that honor bounds, but those lists provide a really interesting insight into some of the challenge of choosing a number. And given so many of these people moved in so many of these societies, not all of them made the cut in the course of the 18th century in the region of Fleet Street. You can see why some people aren't showing up, and therefore there's a refusal to make an engraving for the full number. But very interesting point.
Thank you very much. Can you just go
It's for the ones of mine.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed that indeed, especially for me about the distribution of the engravings, which was perhaps inspired by Le Neve when Rawlinson followed it. I think of Rawlinson as doing the same thing, having charters engraved and then giving them to his friends, and especially to members of the Society of Antiquaries. And the thought came to me that, of course, this society has still today, as does the Bodleian, a great many copper plates, some of which are of the charters, and they would be a magnificent way of raising an honest penny or two for the society or the Bodleian if sheets were pulled. And well, if all those who were sensible enough to come this afternoon were given a copy as a memento, but perhaps we would have to pay something. But those plates are there, and I don't think they've ever been sort of written about in the context of charter copies, which, as you say, are extraordinarily well done.
Excellent. I did not know about the copper plates, but the copper plates are rarely catalogued also. I was in the Dugdale home, and the lovely Tilly Dugdale produced for me the copper plates of the Monasticon, which they possess. Those are the plates of Wenceslas Holler, and they're not there in their listings, and they are wonderful. So I had no idea that they exist here too, but it makes complete sense, Nigel. I think you should have to pursue this business venture on your own, however.
I must say, it passed through my mind that you might be about to distribute engraved copies of your splendid lecture. Are there any online? Are there any more questions in the room? If not, can we just again thank you for a splendid, wide-ranging and really interesting lecture. Thank you very much indeed. All right, I give notice that the next meeting will be the Christmas Miscellany on Thursday, the 8th of December at 5 p.m, when we will hear two papers, a timber castle drawn on stone, a medieval graffito from the Castle of Caen by Dr. Edward Impey, and a cabal of jealous, self-interested men, James Buckler's Backballing the Society of Antiquaries by Joshua Mardell. The meeting will be followed by a mulled wine reception for which tickets can be booked via the Society's website. The meeting stands adjourned.